part two of our teaching in this series then, I want to kind of wrestle a little bit more with this journey and the conversation we're having about the things that might trouble our minds. But I want to just sort of make comment right at the very start that there's something I think important to confess as a Christian community when we engage with a subject area like this. There's a tendency within Christian tradition to think of Christianity and perhaps religion generally as something which has something to do with what goes on in our souls. So Christianity occupies the realm of the spiritual, we might say. And that's a kind of reductionist tendency that happens quite regularly in the Christian world, where we talk about Christianity and we teach about it. We sometimes it invades our worship songs, even our conversation, that really all that Jesus is interested in is what goes on in our souls, in our spirits. But then we confess as Christians that God became human, which I think is one of the most profound and fascinating commentaries on the human state that we could ever have. That God became human. It says something about God and it says something about us. It says something about God, which is to point out that God's not actually just interested in souls and spirits. Christianity is much more broad than simply questions about what goes on in your spiritual life. And the fact that God would become human, and perhaps more importantly, the fact that God would raise Jesus from the dead, suggests that God is profoundly interested in our whole selves, but also that our whole selves are profoundly important to God. And if we confess that Christianity is just about what happens in your spirit, we sort of narrow Christianity down into a very pale shadow of what it actually is to be part of this gospel announcement that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. And of course, if we then are brave enough perhaps to say that God is interested in human stuff, it's why we then can spend time talking about what goes on in our lives, what goes on in our hearts, what goes on in our minds, what goes on in our bodies. And once you decide that actually maybe God is interested in the whole human and all of the aspects of that, you then see the Bible perhaps in different ways. You see texts like Lamentations, a book which literally talks about sadness, lament, and all of the sort of deep emotions that are involved in that. Or what about the book of Ecclesiastes, a book about which the main conversation seems to be doubt. It's okay to have and talk about doubts and process them through. If you read the Psalms are a mixture of all sorts of things, but you will see fears and anxieties of the psalmists coming through in the process of these writings. And what about Job? This big, long book full of conversations in which themes of hopelessness and even what we might today call depression seem to be part and parcel of this story of Scripture. The Bible is intimately aware of what can trouble our minds. And our minds have the ability of being quite troubled. Our minds are complex and also uniquely individual. We all engage with lament and doubt and fear and anxiety. Some of us experience depression. Many of us find ourselves at points in life feeling a little hopeless. And all of this is going on in our mind while we also navigate another tension, which perhaps we can put it like this, that life and what goes on in our heads is often defined at some level by the tension between our memories and our imagination. What we can remember happening to us and what we can imagine might happen to us becomes so part and parcel of the human experience. And often our ability to imagine the future is so affected by what we can remember from the past. If good things have happened, then why not might those good things happen again? And if bad things have happened, who's to say that that's not also part of our future? And so our inner life becomes caught in this tension between what has happened and what might happen. The real, and perhaps you might even be as brave to say the fictional, that's going on in our own minds on a pretty regular basis. And so how do we make sense of that? And how does that make sense in our own situation? I've found Aaron Beck's cognitive theory helpful in understanding this. Essentially, put it like this, Beck's theory was that it's not what happens to you, but what you think that means that impacts you. Oftentimes we assume that life is impacted by the things that happen to us. But then if we start to notice, different things happen to different people. But sometimes similar things happen to different people, but we notice that those people respond differently. That one person has a tragic event and another person has a tragic event, and how their lives go after that is different. Two people can be in the same car wreck, and one person comes away with a nervousness about ever driving a car again. Another person decides that, hey, it was just an accident, it wasn't our fault, and I'll just carry on with life as normal. Both of them involved in the same event, but their interpretation of the events can be hugely different. If you're the type of person that thinks that perhaps you deserve negativity and perhaps you deserve bad stuff to happen to you, when bad stuff happens, its impact on your mind is even stronger because you're assuming that that's what you deserve and that's probably what you should have happen. And so therefore, the events that we go through and how we fit them into what we feel the plot of our life is, or what we feel the story that we are living out is, can have huge impact on us. Think about your memories. Think about how certain memories are almost lost to you, and then other memories seem to sort of float beneath the surface of your life. And it doesn't take much in a moment of thinking or in a moment of reaction to something that particular memories resurface. One minute you're in the aisle choosing green toothpaste or blue toothpaste, and then the next minute you're remembering a fight you had in the schoolyard when you were 14. And you catch yourself sometimes and go, whoa, wait a minute, how did I get from there to there? You're midway through an argument with someone, and all of a sudden you realize rage that you have inside of yourself about something your parents said to you 10 years ago, or something your boss said to you yesterday. Why is it that certain memories float around habitually in our hearts? Perhaps it's because these memories are the ones which we think make sense of the way our lives are unfolding. Whether it's our attempts to please our parents, apparently a thing that many of us never grow out of the pressure to feel like we need to do, or how we raise our children, or how do you impress your peers. All of these things motivate us and affect our desires in different ways. And of course, the more stressful your life is, the more stress you're presently under, you notice how much easier it is to access those formative memories, how much easier it is that you interpret your events slightly differently just by turning up a little bit of stress. In the 1960s, towards the end of the 1960s, Thomas Holmes and Richard Rahe developed what they called the stress scale, essentially asking the question, how much stress does it take to push you over the edge? We sometimes see people that have high levels of stress that we can identify, going through some particularly major event in their lives, and we understand that that is very stressful. But then other people don't seem to have such big items of stress in their situation, yet also seem to be showing the signs and effects of stress in their life. What Holmes and Rahe decided to do was generate a list of 43 stressful life events. I know what you're thinking, just 43? But they found this list of 43 events which many of us can easily experience in the course of their life. They decided the most stressful thing that a person would go through in their life would be the death of a spouse. So they gave that 100 points. And then slowly this list cascades down through things like divorce gaining 73 points, or perhaps changes in your business life generating about 39, finances affect in various different ways from taking out mortgages to being bankrupt and so on. Fascinatingly, they gave 29 points to a child leaving home. Exactly the same stress number they gave to having trouble with your in-laws. I'm just going to leave that out there for you to make sense of that as you wish. They also put right down to things which we wouldn't automatically consider stressful, like taking a vacation. They gave 13 points to. Right the way down to minor law breaking at the bottom of the list, gaining 11 points. Yep, even those speeding tickets are stressful. Or perhaps the stress of worrying about whether you're about to get that speeding ticket is actually the stressful thing. What they were aiming to do and managed to do was establish a link between the things that go on in our lives that are stressful and how that impacts on us. So what they decided was that you could take these numbers of all of these various stressful events and add them together. And if your total score was 150 or higher, they then started to plot that people who lived with a regular level of stress, 150 or higher, were on a journey that almost certainly would lead to some form of illness, be it mental or physical illness. Stress can have that much impact on you. For those of you that are interested, on our website, if you go to the Teach Plus pages on our website, we've actually put an interactive Holmes and Rahe stress scale there that you can take. Not during the service. This isn't like the survey we did earlier, but maybe afterwards you might find it interesting. And what they discovered was it's not necessarily about what particular stressful thing you're dealing with, but it's a compendium of stress. So one person might be going through major stressful events, but if you have enough minor stressful events coming on your life, and all of a sudden then you just decide to take a vacation, those 13 vacation points can just push you over the edge. And maybe you can experience that sometimes it doesn't seem to take much. You're dealing with all of this stress on a regular basis, and then all of a sudden, just one little tiny extra thing happens, and you feel yourself cracking. You feel yourself breaking. But what Holmes and Rahe were warning us of is it's not just simply that you feel this break, but this starts to physically and mentally affect you in really profound and important ways, which is why we notice that stress creates health, physiological health responses, and mental ones, such as the growth of our anxieties and our depressions. When I was reflecting on some of this stuff, I found myself drawn, as others have been before me, to the story of the biblical patriarch Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, who we spent some time talking about earlier on in our teaching year. And the story from Abraham continues till we end up with this man called Jacob. And Jacob's life, you might want to say, I don't think they said this in ancient times, but if we were to read the story of Jacob's life today, we would probably say that guy had some stress issues. Jacob lived in a world where being born first in your family was profoundly important. And he was born second. But he was second by seconds. When Jacob was born, he was a twin. His brother, he was so close himself to being born ahead of his brother that when they came out, he was holding his brother's ankle. Holding the ankle of the firstborn son is about as close as you can be to being the firstborn son and not be. It doesn't get any closer than that. The problem was being second-born son in a culture like that puts you at the back of the line. You're not the most respected in the family. You're not in line for the inheritance in the family. And significantly, you will not receive the father's blessing, which is only given to the firstborn son. So by a matter of seconds, Jacob's whole life is pitched into a very different one than that of his brother. It gets better than that. For some reason which only they seem to understand in ancient times, the family looked at this situation of him being born, grabbing onto his brother's heel, and they decided grasps the heel is a great name for Jacob. Because Jacob, the Hebrew word Jacob, sounds like the term to grasp the heel. So they decided, let's call him that, because that's what you want. The first moment of your life being you failing is a great name to carry for your whole life. The problem is grasps the heel in Hebrew is a kind of way to talk about someone being a deceiver. Hey, have you met my friend, the deceiver? Kind of hard to set up a business for yourself. You know, when your business card says the deceiver, you know, the deceitful one, the one who will trip you up. Like if you're watching a Batman movie and the bad guy rocks out and his name's something like the Joker, you kind of know this is probably the bad guy in the story. This is not the guy to trust. And here this guy wanders around with this name, the deceiver. The thing is, his mom actually likes Jacob more than the firstborn son. Jacob is his favorite. And I know parents always say they don't have favorites, but we all know that's not true. And Jacob is the favorite. And Jacob, I'm just kidding, kids. Jacob is the favorite one. And his mother and him collude. Jacob pulls a bit of a swizz with his big brother and convinces him to trade out their inheritance. So Jacob ends up trading him for the first inheritance that the firstborn should get. His mother manufactures a situation, you can read about it in your own time, but in Genesis, his mother manufactures a situation that Jacob tricks his father into getting the blessing that the firstborn son should get. This is great. Jacob's now first in line of inheritance, first in line for the blessing. The problem is the elder brother decides that the solution to this is to kill Jacob. So Jacob goes on the run. Jacob has to leave his family, his home, his community, his culture in a world where that isn't really how you do life. And he's on the run. I think that sounds like a stressful situation. Particularly if you think about stress, a psychologist would talk about it. They would say that stress is when you find yourself in a situation or in a particular condition where the demands of the situation are greater than you can respond to. That's where stress starts to build. Basically, when the situation's bigger than you. In less formal terms, we might describe it like this: when it feels out of control. How do we live in a context like that? How does Jacob live in a context like that? In Genesis 28, verse 11 to 15, we find out, when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. It's dark. Now, let me just say this about life. When you lie down in your bed at night, and your bed is the ground, and your pillow is a stone, and you breathe out, the thought that goes through your mind isn't, things are going great. This is rock bottom, quite literally. And Jacob lies there, and that's where his life has come to. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. The imagery of this story, the imagery that's used here for many of us, articulates what stressed modern life feels like. You, in the role of Jacob, sleeping on a stone where everybody else seems to be ascending this ladder. The whole world is going on and everybody's doing well, and there's all sorts of excitement about how well things seem to be going. They're moving and everything's happening, and you're just stuck lying on a stone. Because there's something fascinating about us humans, that the areas in which we can find comparison of ourselves with others are endless. We're constantly comparing ourselves. And it's remarkable how often we're comparing ourselves against those we perceive to be doing better than us. I'm on the stone, and look at what everybody else is doing. Think of the things that we compare ourselves with others about. We compare ourselves about the type of jobs that we have. We compare ourselves to the kind of clothes that we wear. We compare our promotion cycles with each other. We compare what streets we live in, what type of neighborhood we find ourselves in. We compare house sizes with other people's house sizes. What is the quality of your house in its particular size? And then once we've worn out doing that, we compare quantity. How many houses do you have? I have a house here and a house there and a house there, but they seem to have more houses than that. We compare vacations. Is my vacation better than your vacation? Because if your vacation is better than my vacation, that says a lot about me. And then we have children. Some people even compare how many children they have to other people in the neighborhood, because clearly children are a marker of success. Don't think too much about what. And then our children, that really drives us crazy, because now we worry about all the same things about us for our children. Are our children smarter than other people's children? Are our children more impressive at sports than other people's children? Are our children taller or better looking or better behaved? And then as our children get older, we start to ask really strange questions like, are our children's houses better than our neighbors' children's houses? And do our children have more houses than our neighbors' children have houses? And this goes on and on and on, where we constantly ask ourselves these questions. This, Dean Burnett tells us, is because our brains use other humans to calibrate how we see the world and our position in it. For some reason, we like to know what other people are doing and judge ourselves accordingly. Because we value other people's approval. Anybody else's approval we value. For some strange reason, we even value the approval of our comparison against people that we've never met and will never meet again. This explains the profoundly complex human psychology of why we only ever sing karaoke when we're drunk. Because when we're sober, we worry about what a room of strangers think of us. For some reason, even a room that we'll never meet again and never have known before, we're interested in what they think about our pitch and tone. For some reason, we're constantly comparing ourselves. Psychologist Leon Festinger proposed what we now call the social comparison theory. That for some reason, Despite humans having all sorts of quantitative scales that we can judge ourselves against, physical fixed lists that we can compare ourselves against to see how we're doing, the one thing we constantly choose to do is compare ourselves against others. How am I doing? It's not how rich I am on a scale, it's how rich I am in comparison to other people that I know. It's not how successful I am in contrast with history, it's how successful I am in contrast with the people that I want to compare myself to. And here's the problem. When we constantly live in this comparison, not being able to keep up, not being able to compare, comparing and always finding yourself inferior creates a stigma in us. A stigma that processes its way through our systems much the same way that our stigmas about mental health happen. In fact, the two seem to be very, very related. That we have this pressure to maintain the highest levels. And if we can't maintain the highest level, and most of us are intimately aware of the fact and the stress is generated by not being able to, this just generates more stress and therefore more anxiety and quite probably then more depression. And of course, there's no let up now that we have social media. Because if the data is true, the most common thing that many of us do the moment we wake up in the morning is check our phones to see what stunningly exciting thing has happened overnight on Instagram. And then the data also tells us that the last thing that we do, the thing after we've even said goodnight to our loved ones and even our partner, is check our phone once more. Which means that for all of your waking hours, you're living in a world of constant social comparison. How is your life adding up to the lives of those you're comparing yourself? How is your life going in contrast to everybody else's life? And then what starts to happen in us is we start seeing these expectations that we might have, not as future hopes that maybe one day I might achieve X or Y, but rather that these are things I must achieve now and can achieve now. Because everybody else seems to be doing so well, I should be doing so well as well. And as a result, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment. The constant comparison starts to root into our soul. Because our society has stratospheric expectations of your personal productivity, of your well-being, and of your achievements. But if you add them all together, if you add all of the things that both our society tells us we should be and the things that we believe we should be, you are guaranteed to fail. You can't be brilliant at everything. Not everybody is brilliant at everything. But if we attempt to live that way, all that we're ensuring in our lives is that we fall short. And these pressures are huge and growing. Let me ask you a question. How much free time do your children have? If you don't have children, have a look at the free time that your friends' children have. Our society has become so unhealthy with achieving the standards that we think we should have that we're even imposing this on our children now. If I was to ask many of us, where do our children imagine and dream and let their creativity run free anymore? Because for many of us outside of school, we've got our children programmed into all sorts of different processes and programs and schools and classes just because we're terrified at the thought that maybe, just maybe, there's another kid in your kid's class that's slightly better at math. So as a result, we take away all of that beautiful dreaming time that our children have and we enroll them in a class that improves them on here. Or we enroll them in another class over there that helps them ski better because woe betide, our children can't ski as well as somebody else's children. And we're slowly generating all of this stress to the point that if you sit down and talk with many teenagers nowadays, you'll find them talk about the stress of keeping up with their recreational activities. Because somewhere we've gotten so unhealthy with our need to compare and be better that we're even pouring it into the lives of our future generations. Astronomical expectations. They're constantly reaffirming one thing that we probably don't want to affirm, which is that you get your self-worth through your achievements. This is to forget, of course, that being limited is perfectly human, perfectly normal. There's nothing abnormal about not being as good as somebody else in particular areas. There's nothing weird and strange about not being the top of every class that you ever go into. There's nothing strange about not being the best person at your particular work. But if you live with a deep dissatisfaction that you can't keep up with everybody else, then what we do know is that subtle dissatisfaction that kind of ekes away at your sense of your own moral limitations is actually what we would describe psychologically as mild depression. That mild depression that comes from just not being quite happy and unable to accept that you can't keep up with everybody. And therefore, we find ourselves feeling cornered, find ourselves as if we're just not doing as well as we should be. And feeling cornered in itself isn't fun. Because when we're cornered but don't want to be cornered, or cornered and don't want anyone to know that we're cornered, we end up having to do something that many of us, perhaps if we're honest, have done. We put on a face, we tell a lie, we hide behind a secret that pretends that we're doing okay. So we arrive at work trying to live out the expectations of others. We perform our public image in a way that we imagine our audience want to see of us. Here's the fascinating thing. If we could create moments of truthfulness, it strikes me that the data tells us that this is so holistic in our society, that it's so much the case that we're all struggling with it, that guy the other side of the office that you're working really hard to impress, to ensure that he knows you're keeping up with him, there's a real high likelihood that he's looking back across the office at you, trying to keep up with you. And we're all playing this sort of game of trying to pretend that we don't realize we're all lying to each other. The scary thing is sometimes we don't even realize it, that we're all playing this game of trying to keep up. And most of the time, it's actually covering over the fact that there's this constant nagging feeling in our contemporary world that's generating so much of our stress, which is to say that we're not keeping up. But we like our secrets. You might want to say it like this: in the world of performancism, success equals life and failure is tantamount to death. This is one reason why people would rather end their lives than confess that they've lost their jobs or made a bad investment. You know it's a stigma when you keep it private even to the point of death. That you're uncomfortable. How will people feel about me if they know this about me? How will my neighbors feel if they know that things are not as great as I'm pretending they are? And our mental health, and sometimes even our physical health, how we feel, is something that we don't talk about. We force ourselves just to live with it. These strange anxieties, these worries, these stress patterns. And many people, psychologists tell us, only seek professional help, when truthfully, it's gone so far that now they're desperate. Now they're just clinging on. But this is murmuring away in so many of our lives that we don't want to admit that the pressures are so high. But here's the thing, and I want to say this with hopefully the compassion that I mean it. Sometimes you sleep on a stone. Sometimes you are just not as good as somebody else. Sometimes they're better than you. Sometimes they're more successful than you. Sometimes they do appear like they are doing better than you, and maybe they are. Sometimes bad stuff happens. Sometimes life conspires against you. Sometimes you're just born second, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sometimes that's just life. Life isn't promised to us as some endless success story. Life doesn't promise you that everything will go well for you. And how much of our anxiety and stress and depression is created by attempting to live under the astronomical expectations that that's not true? We generate this stress and this anxiety in our lives because we refuse to admit that sometimes life just deals out a bad set of cards for you. And you find yourself like Jacob, completely out of control. What could he do about being born second? Despite all his scheming, all his efforts, all his best attempts to manufacture the situation, he finds himself sleeping on a stone because he couldn't really change it. And then looking at this ladder and believing that that's the right way forward, that if we could just climb that, improve this, achieve that, then everything will be okay with us. But maybe we need to confess that the ladder isn't healthy, that what it's asking of us isn't good for us. And so Jacob is out of options. He's lying on a stone. This is about as low as it gets. And he hears the voice of God. I don't know if you noticed it when we read the text a few minutes ago, but how beautiful and different the voice of God was. Jacob has lived with all of the demands of his society, with all of the requirements and expectations as who he should be. And what he's ended up with is lying on the ground with a stone for a pillow. And then God speaks to him. And instead of further demands and further requirements, what Jacob actually hears is a voice of promise. God simply talks to Jacob about what he is going to do for Jacob. Jacob is given promises and affirmations and reminded of what it is that God is and how it is that God is working. He's encouraged to step away from the burnout, perhaps, and the exhaustion and the stress. Because promise means rest. Because God doesn't give Jacob anything to do. He doesn't give us another hurdle to jump over, another step on the ladder to climb. He simply reaffirms this promise, this beautiful promise of what it is that he's doing in his life. And in the process of that, Jacob makes a groundbreaking discovery. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." The groundbreaking discovery is that God is at the bottom of the ladder. That God is not the one calling Jacob upwards. God is not the one calling Jacob saying, if you can just achieve this or gain that or meet this standard, then you'll find me. God is not the one that says, Jacob, here's the hurdles. If you jump all of them, then maybe I've got something for you. But God meets Jacob at the bottom of the ladder or the bottom of your pit or when your stone is a pillow. Because you don't need to chase God. You don't need to keep up to some standard that we've set for ourselves. We don't need to compare ourselves against others to find him with us. One of the reasons this year why I wanted to spend so much of our time teaching through Romans, and Romans says a lot of things to us, but one thing hopefully you're hearing through the pages of this incredible epistle is this constant reminder that if you think God is the one generating your stress or inferiority, then you're not quite hearing the gospel properly. Because the message that Paul wants to shape out for us is that God has done it in advance. He has called us prior to it all being done. He has met us where we are and not where we're trying to get to. God is not the one at the top of the ladder. God is the one at the bottom of the ladder. The Lord was in this place and I just wasn't aware of it. And think about that word here. It's a beautiful word in this context, especially when you realize it's used here in contrast to there. God is here, not there. God is giving us permission to be okay where we are, permission to not chase the successes that the world offers, permission not to compare ourselves with other people. And perhaps here is one of the most countercultural words in a world of there. Because there is where we never get. There is where we miss everything that is here. If you're constantly looking at the top of this ladder, what you miss is that God is here. Jacob was in God's space all along. God was here, and I was not aware of it, says Jacob. I was not aware of it. You see, because what Christianity, what the biblical story offers to us, isn't sleep for the insomniac. It isn't fearlessness for those with anxiety, and it isn't endless happiness for those who are depressed. What Christianity does offer us is God's relentless presence in the midst of the unbearable weight of life. It's fascinating if you notice that nothing actually changes for Jacob. His brother still wants to kill him. His family are still far off. He's still cut off from everything that's familiar to him. If you keep reading the story, Jacob's about to meet an uncle who is more deceitful even than Jacob himself. And Jacob's going to find himself caught up in 14 years of pain where his uncle tricks him into free labor, essentially, for 14 years. This story's got a long way to play out. Jacob's still got to deal with life, but one thing he learns in the midst of all of this mess is that he's not alone, that God is with him, that God is here. And Jacob, you'll notice, takes a long time to learn the lesson. A long time to learn this lesson that he doesn't need to keep comparing himself. He doesn't need to keep chasing this particular standard. He needs to remember that God is here. But the story ends like this. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Jacob realizes that if God is here, then everything is different. And God is here. He is in this with us. Nothing's changed, but in another sense, everything's different. And so Luz becomes Bethel. The city Luz, ironically, in the way that Bible stories seem to work out for us, the city Luz kind of roughly in the Hebrew translates to the idea of a place of being cut off, a place of being deceived. So ironically, the man whose name is Deceiver finds himself sleeping on a stone pillow outside a city called Deceived. And Jacob wakes up and he realizes that God was with him and he calls the place Beit El in Hebrew, Bethel, the house of God. Because you see, our stress and our anxiety and our depression and our burnout, our exhaustions, they perhaps are unimaginable to those who are not living with it. But what we find in Christ, what we find in the human God, is that we're never alone. He knows our journey. He confesses the importance of what it is for us to be human, and he is right there with us. Our places of feeling alone, deceived, and departed can become the house of God. Let me pray for you this morning. Anne Lamott writes a brilliant book on the three most important prayers. The book is called Help, Thanks, and Wow. These perhaps are the three most important prayers. But in this book, she says that if we are to practice the presence of God, perhaps we would word it this morning like, if we are going to remember that God is here with us and that we need to be aware of it, then perhaps we should admit to the three most terrible truths of our existence. That we are so ruined, but we're also so loved and also in charge of so little. And so, Father God, we confess how little we feel in control. Help us to realize that we're probably in control of even less than we think we are. But help us to remember that you are always here, even when our lives are so consumed with the stresses of trying to be there. Amen.